The city bus screeched to a halt on a bustling main street, its doors opening with a sharp hiss. Commuters shuffled in, clutching their coats against the brisk morning air. Among them was Clara Hayes, a dignified woman in her early 70s. Her polished demeanor, upright posture, and eyes that sparkled with quiet resolve set her apart. With her purse held firmly, she stepped aboard and offered a polite nod to the driver, Greg Hansen. Hansen barely glanced at her, his lips curling into a scowl. As Clara dropped her coins into the fare box and steadied herself, his gruff voice cut through the hum of the engine. "Move it along," he snapped, irritation dripping from his tone. Clara met his eyes briefly but said nothing, choosing to find a seat near the front. She grasped a pole for support as the bus jolted forward. The quiet faces of her fellow passengers stared ahead, offering no solace. "Not there," Hansen barked, loud enough to silence even the faint rustle of newspapers. Clara stopped mid-step and turned to face him. "Excuse me?" "You heard me," Hansen growled. "Seats up front aren't for people like you. Back of the bus." A hush fell over the passengers. A young woman near the window pulled her child closer, her gaze dropping to her lap. An older man shifted uneasily, his attention suddenly absorbed by his newspaper. Clara's calm expression didn't waver. She stepped forward, her voice steady. "I've paid my fare," she said clearly. "I'll sit where I choose." The bus screeched to a stop, throwing passengers forward as they gripped poles and armrests for balance. Hansen stood abruptly, pointing a trembling finger at Clara. "You don't make the rules here," he spat. "Move to the back or get off my bus. Those are your options." A murmur of unease rippled through the bus. In the middle row, a young man quietly pulled out his phone, the faint glow of its recording light barely noticeable. Clara squared her shoulders and met Hansen's glare. "I'm not going anywhere," she said firmly. Hansen's face turned a deep shade of red. "We'll see about that," he snarled. He grabbed the radio and called sharply for transit security. The low rumble of the idling engine filled the heavy silence as the bus remained parked on the crowded street. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their whispers growing louder. "I'm not repeating myself," Hansen growled, stepping out from behind the wheel. His uniform strained against his broad frame, his face contorted with rage. "Move, or I'll remove you myself." Clara's voice remained calm, her gaze unwavering. "I've done nothing wrong. I've paid my fare. I'll sit where I please." Hansen's fists clenched at his sides. "You think you're special? I make the rules on this bus. If I tell you to move, you move." The tension in the air was palpable. A young mother cradled her squirming toddler tighter. An older man tugged at his tie, staring fixedly out the window. A teenage girl whispered, her voice tinged with disbelief. "This is absurd." Clara raised her voice slightly, her tone firm but not angry. "I'm not breaking any rules. What you're doing is wrong, and you know it." Hansen's face twisted in fury. "You don't get to decide what's right," he shouted. "People are trying to get to work. You're the one causing a scene." He gestured to the passengers, seemingly expecting their agreement. Most looked away, avoiding his gaze. In the middle of the bus, the young man with the phone spoke up, his voice cutting through the tension. "She's not causing a scene. You're holding everyone up," he said. Hansen whipped around, glaring. "Stay out of this. It's none of your business." The young man leaned back, unshaken, continuing to film. The bus jerked as Hansen stomped back to his seat. He barked into his radio, his voice crackling over the speaker. "Dispatch. This is Route 17. I have a passenger refusing to comply, requesting immediate assistance." The murmurs among the passengers grew louder. A woman near the back muttered under her breath, "She's not doing anything wrong. Why is he making such a fuss?" Clara turned her head slightly, addressing the passengers. Her voice carried a note of conviction. "This isn't just about me. It's about what's right." Hansen's voice interrupted sharply. "Save the speech," he snapped. "You're off this bus the second security gets here." A little boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, his whisper loud enough to carry. "Why is the driver yelling at her?" The mother hushed him nervously, glancing at Hansen. Clara smiled gently at the boy, her voice soft. "Sometimes people don't like being challenged when they know they're wrong." "Don't talk to him," Hansen barked, his frustration erupting. The passengers flinched at his booming voice. A young man spoke up again, his tone steady. "You're digging yourself into a hole, man. Everyone's gonna see this." The bus fell silent again. the passengers holding their collective breath, waiting for what would happen next. Hansen glared at him, his jaw tightening, but he didn't respond. The tension thickened as the distant wail of a siren began to rise above the background noise of the street, signaling the approach of transit security. Clara remained unmoved, her posture unwavering. Her presence was a stark contrast to Hansen's simmering rage. The other passengers grew quieter, their eyes darting between Clara and the driver as the sound of the siren grew louder, pressing down on them like an unrelenting weight. The bus door hissed open with a sharp exhale, and Hansen returned to his seat, shooting Clara occasional frustrated glances. The officers stepped inside, their dark uniforms striking against the pale morning light pouring through the windows. "She's the problem," Hansen blurted out, standing abruptly and jabbing a finger in Clara's direction. "She's refusing to comply, holding up the whole route and causing a scene." The officers exchanged glances before turning their neutral expressions toward Clara. One of them, a tall man with a calm demeanor, spoke first. "Ma'am," he said in a measured tone, "we received a report about a passenger refusing to follow the driver's instructions. Can you explain your side of the story?" Clara met his gaze without faltering. Her voice was steady and clear, her words deliberate. "I paid my fare just like everyone else," she said. "The driver told me to move to the back of the bus for no reason other than his prejudice." "That's not true," Hansen interjected, his voice rising. "I told her these seats are for priority passengers. She doesn't belong here." "Priority for who?" Clara countered, her sharp gaze fixed on him. "The elderly? Because I certainly qualify. Or do you have some other criteria I'm unaware of?" The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. The tension in the bus was palpable. Some passengers murmured softly among themselves, their unease growing as the confrontation continued. A young mother, sitting a few rows back, shifted her squirming toddler onto her lap. "Why doesn't she just move?" she whispered to the man next to her, though her words carried enough weight to be heard. "This is holding everyone up." "It's not worth the fight," the man muttered back, his tone tinged with irritation. Clara turned her head slightly in their direction. Her voice was calm but resolute as she replied, "Some fights are worth it." The young man recording the event leaned forward. "She's right. Why is he even bothering her? There's nothing wrong with her sitting up front." Hansen whipped around, his glare sharp. "Stay out of this, kid. It's none of your business." "Isn't it?" The young man shot back, his tone unwavering. "You've made it everyone's business by stopping the bus." Several passengers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable but increasingly aware of the injustice unfolding before them. A teenage girl sitting a few rows ahead of Clara whispered to the woman beside her, her voice tinged with disbelief. "I can't believe this is happening. It's like something out of a history book." "It's not history," the woman replied quietly. "It's now." The siren's wail faded as a police cruiser pulled up outside, and the officers inside the bus straightened. The passengers tensed as the confrontation reached its peak, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like an unrelenting tide. The officers turned back to Clara, their expressions cautious. "Ma'am, the simplest way to resolve this would be to move to another seat," one of them said, his tone almost pleading. Clara's response was unwavering. "I'm not the one delaying this bus," she said. "He is. And if I move now, he'll think it's okay to keep treating people this way. It's not." The officers exchanged uneasy looks as the tension simmered. Outside, curious onlookers began to gather, their faces peering through the bus windows as they tried to understand the commotion. Clara stood firm, her quiet defiance radiating strength. The bus was no longer just a vehicle. It had become a battleground for dignity and justice. The teenage girl from earlier, who had whispered her disbelief, suddenly stood up. Though her voice trembled, her words rang with conviction. "She's right," she declared loudly. "Why should she have to move? He's the one being unfair." "Sit down," Hansen barked, his frustration boiling over. His face reddened as he pointed toward the girl. "You want me to throw you off too?" "That's enough," the first officer said sharply, raising a hand toward Hansen. "Sir, we'll handle this." The young man with the phone spoke again, his tone defiant as he refused to be silenced. "Everyone's already seeing this," he said. "This video's going viral, man. By tonight, the whole city will know." A wave of murmurs rippled through the passengers. Near the back, a man in a suit who had been quiet until now finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "This is ridiculous," he said. "She hasn't done anything wrong. Just let her stay where she is, and we can all get going." Hansen's face turned crimson, his fists clenching tightly at his sides. "You people don't get it," he snarled. "Rules are rules. You can't just let anyone sit up here." Clara's voice cut through the tension, firm and clear. "Anyone?" she repeated, her words carrying weight. "Or just people who look like me?" The bus fell silent again, her question hanging heavily in the air. Even the officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, unsure of how to respond. Outside, pedestrians began to gather, their curiosity drawing them closer to the stalled bus. Some pointed their phones at the commotion, recording from the street. Inside, the young man with the phone tilted his camera toward the growing crowd outside. "Looks like people out there want to know what's going on too," he said, more to himself than anyone else. The second officer sighed, the pressure mounting visibly. He turned back to Clara. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "are you sure you won't step off the bus? It might de-escalate the situation and let everyone move on." Clara stood tall, her shoulders back and her gaze unwavering. "No," she said firmly. "I've done nothing wrong. I won't be treated like this. Not today." The officers hesitated, their authority caught between Clara's calm defiance and Hansen's escalating rage. Hansen muttered under his breath as he returned to his seat, his hands gripping the steering wheel with white-knuckled frustration. The atmosphere inside the bus was electric. Passengers shifted uneasily, at their tension mirrored in the growing crowd outside. The low hum of the idling engine seemed to amplify the murmurs filtering in from the street, where more bystanders gathered to observe the standoff. Clara remained steady, her quiet dignity speaking louder than any words could. She was a pillar of resolve amid the chaos. Her presence challenged the passengers' initial hesitancy, and now their unease gave way to a quiet solidarity. One of the officers sighed heavily and turned to Hansen. "Sir, what exactly are you asking us to do here?" he asked, his voice laced with exasperation. "She's not being aggressive. She's not a threat." Hansen threw his hands up in frustration, his voice rising. "Are you serious? She's refusing to follow instructions. I can't do my job with someone like her up here, disrupting everything." A young woman sitting near the middle of the bus, her voice trembling but defiant, called out, "You're the one making a scene, not her." Several passengers murmured in agreement. The teenage girl who had spoken earlier stood up again, gripping the edge of her seat for support. "Yeah," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "She's just sitting there. What's the big deal?" Hansen whipped his head toward her, his glare sharp. "You want me to throw you off too?" he snapped. "Sit down and stay out of it." "Let's keep this civil," the first officer interjected, his tone firm but weary. He turned back to Clara, speaking more softly. "Ma'am, are you absolutely sure you won't consider moving? It might make things easier for everyone." Clara's eyes never wavered as she replied, her voice calm but resolute. "If I move, it'll be easier for him, not for everyone else. And I won't give him that satisfaction." Suddenly, the sharp chime of a phone broke the tension. The young man with the phone smirked and raised the device slightly, the glow of the screen catching the officer's attention. "Looks like it's already online," he said casually. "And people are watching." The weight of his words hung in the air as the passengers braced for what would happen next. The young man announced, holding up his phone. "Over 1,000 views in 5 minutes." Greg Hansen's face darkened, his jaw clenching so tightly it looked like it might snap. His voice dropped, low and menacing. "You put this on the internet?" he growled. "Damn right I did," the young man replied, his tone steady and unflinching. "People need to see this. You can't treat someone like this and expect to get away with it." A ripple of agreement passed through the passengers. Those who had been silent earlier began murmuring their approval. From the back of the bus, the man in the suit spoke up, his voice calm but cutting. "This isn't the 1950s. She has every right to sit wherever she wants." The sound of Hansen slamming his fist onto the dashboard startled everyone, silencing the murmurs. "That's it," he bellowed. "She's off this bus, or we're not going anywhere." The officers visibly stiffened at his tone, their patience clearly wearing thin. The first officer stepped forward, his expression now hardened with authority. "Sir," he said sharply, "if you keep escalating this, you'll be the one facing consequences. You called us here to handle the situation, so let us do our job." Outside, the crowd pressed closer to the bus, their chatter growing louder. Some raised their phones to record the scene. A man in a construction vest called out, "What's going on in there? Why isn't the bus moving?" "Driver's being a racist jerk," someone yelled from the back of the bus, drawing laughter and scattered cheers from the gathering crowd. The second officer rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on him. He turned back to Clara, his tone softer but still firm. "Ma'am, I understand your position, and I don't blame you, but this is getting bigger by the minute. Are you sure you want to keep this going?" Clara's eyes swept over the crowd outside, their expressions a mixture of outrage and curiosity. She glanced around the bus, taking in the faces of passengers, some sympathetic, others impatient. Finally, she looked at the young man with the phone and gave him a small nod. "Yes," she said, her voice unwavering. "I'm sure. This isn't about me, it's about what's right." The officer straightened, giving her a nod of reluctant acknowledgement. "All right, ma'am. Then we'll stay here until this is resolved properly." Hansen let out a derisive laugh, shaking his head. "You're just going to let her get away with this?" Unbelievable. The first officer turned sharply toward him, his patience clearly gone. "One more outburst like that, and I'll report you for misconduct." Hansen fell silent, though his expression remained a mask of barely contained fury. Inside the bus, the tension was electric, every passenger teetering on the edge of their seat. Outside, the crowd's murmurs grew louder, their voices joining together in a chant that echoed through the bus doors. "Let her sit, let her sit." Finally, Clara moved to sit down, her head held high and her back straight. Her quiet defiance radiated strength, a stark contrast to Hansen's growing agitation. The officers exchanged a glance before stepping outside to address the swelling crowd. As the bus doors hissed shut behind them, the driver remained in his seat, fuming, while the passengers buzzed with murmurs of approval. The young man with the phone lowered it slightly and grinned at Clara. "You're a legend, ma'am," he said. "This video's going to blow up." Clara gave him a faint smile, but said nothing, her focus still fixed on Hansen. She knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time it felt like the tide was beginning to turn in her favor. Outside, the officers attempted to calm the crowd, but the chants only grew louder. The rhythmic cries of let her sit," echoed in unison. Inside, the passengers exchanged glances. Their unease was now mingled with a sense of curiosity and resolve. Clara sat poised, her gaze fixed ahead on the windshield, even as she felt Hansen's burning glare from his seat. His knuckles were white as he gripped the steering wheel, his anger simmering just below the surface. The young man lifted his phone again, this time panning it across the rows of passengers to capture their reactions. "You see this?" he asked, his voice loud enough to carry. "This is what standing up looks like. Y'all better remember her face because she's making history right now." Hansen's head snapped toward the young man. "Turn that damn thing off," he barked. "You're disrupting this bus just as much as she is." The young man smirked, unbothered. "Disrupting? Nah, I'm documenting. There's a difference." Another passenger, a middle-aged woman clutching a worn leather bag, spoke up for the first time. "Honestly, we should all be documenting this," she said. "He's treating her like garbage for no reason." Hansen turned his glare toward her, his anger spilling over. "Lady, you don't know what you're talking about," he snapped, but his words only seemed to embolden the passengers further. The tide had shifted. Clara's quiet courage, paired with the growing solidarity of those around her, was turning the bus into a stage for justice. "You don't know what you're talking about." Greg Hansen snapped, his frustration bubbling over. "I've been driving this route for years. I know how to deal with troublemakers." "Troublemaker?" The teenage girl from earlier fired back, standing again despite the driver's earlier threats. "She's literally just sitting there. How's that causing trouble?" "Oh, you all want to play heroes now, huh?" Hansen barked, his voice rising in pitch and anger. "Fine, but don't come crying to me when this bus doesn't move." From the back of the bus, the man in the suit stood, his calm demeanor a sharp contrast to Hansen's escalating fury. "We've all been sitting here long enough," he said, his tone firm. If you can't handle this professionally, maybe you shouldn't be driving. Hansen's face flushed crimson. You think you can do my job better, pal? Be my guest. Maybe I would, the man shot back coolly, if it meant treating people like humans. He sat down as murmurs of agreement rippled through the bus. Outside, the chants grew louder, their rhythm punctuated by the occasional honk of a car horn as drivers slowed to watch the scene unfold. A reporter pushed through the growing crowd, her camera's red recording light visible through the bus's smudged windows. Hansen, now visibly rattled, grabbed the radio from its holder. Dispatch. This is Route 5. Situation's getting worse. There's a crowd outside now. We need more officers. The radio crackled in response. Additional units are en route. Hold tight. Clara Hayes let out a quiet breath, her composure unshaken. She turned to the young man with the phone, who was still documenting everything. You should focus on the crowd too, she said softly. This is bigger than just this bus. The young man nodded, angling his phone toward the window to capture the swelling sea of faces and signs demanding justice. You're right, he replied, but you're still the star here. Hansen slammed his hand onto the dashboard, the sharp thud startling several passengers. I'm sick of this circus, he bellowed. Anyone who has a problem with me, get off my bus right now. No one moved. The teenage girl folded her arms defiantly, the man in the suit stared out the window, and the young mother tightened her hold on her child, but remained silent. Even the passengers who had seemed hesitant earlier stayed firmly in their seats, their quiet unity a stark rebuttal to Hansen's outburst. Clara turned her head slowly, her gaze locking onto Hansen. Her voice was low but carried easily through the bus. You don't get to decide who belongs here. That's not your job. Hansen opened his mouth to reply, but hesitated. His jaw tightened, the realization sinking in that his authority was slipping away. Outside, the chants continued to rise in volume, a steady roar of voices demanding justice. The crowd swelled into a small sea of people, with phones and cameras pointed toward the bus, capturing every moment. One of the officers stepped back onto the bus, his expression tight with frustration. Driver, he said firmly, we need to de-escalate this now. The crowd's growing, and the media's here. This situation is out of control. Hansen scoffed, throwing his hands up. Oh, so now it's my fault, he shot back. I told you how to handle this. Get her off the bus. The officer shook his head. No, if we try to force her off now, we're going to have a much bigger problem on our hands. The crowd's not on your side. Clara's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. She turned her attention back to the window, where signs had started appearing in the crowd. One read, Justice for Clara, while another hastily scrawled on cardboard simply said, End the hate. Hansen slumped back into his seat, his face a mask of fury and helplessness. Clara, meanwhile, remained calm, her presence unshaken. The energy inside the bus began to shift. The passengers no longer felt like mere onlookers. They were witnesses to something much larger than a delayed commute. The officer turned to Clara, his tone softening. Ma'am, we're working on resolving this. Just stay seated. Clara nodded, folding her hands neatly in her lap. I wasn't planning on moving, she replied calmly. The officer stepped off the bus again, and Hansen sat in a brooding silence. Outside, the crowd's chants had grown deafening, a unified call for justice that reverberated through the bus's open doors. Inside, the passengers seemed to sit a little straighter. Their nervous energy was replaced with a quiet resolve, as if Clara's defiance had sparked something in them. The officer's voice crackled faintly over his radio as he tried to manage the swelling crowd outside. Inside, the tension reached a breaking point. Hansen sat stiffly in his seat, his fingers tapping impatiently against the steering wheel, each motion sharper and more erratic than the last. Clara, however, remained composed. Her chin was held high, and her gaze stayed fixed on the windshield ahead. Through the window she could see the crowd demanding justice, their chants filling the air. It wasn't just a moment anymore, it was a movement. The chants outside, "Let her sit," grew louder, shaking the walls of the bus like a drumbeat of justice. Greg Hansen, his face a storm of barely contained fury, glared at Clara Hayes. You think you're some kind of hero? He growled, his voice trembling with anger. He stood abruptly, his chair screeching under his weight. You're not. You're just a troublemaker making my life harder. Clara remained unflinching, her calm demeanor only stoking Hansen's rage. "What I am," she said, her voice unwavering, "is someone who's tired of being pushed around. If you can't handle that, maybe you're in the wrong job." Hansen's face turned beet red, his fists trembling. "That's it. I'm done playing nice," he bellowed, stalking toward her, the veins in his neck pulsing. Passengers gasped, some crying out in alarm. "What are you doing?" the teenage girl from earlier shouted, standing halfway in her seat. "You can't do that," yelled the young man with the phone, angling his camera to capture every second. Hansen ignored them all, his focus locked on Clara. His large frame loomed over her, casting a shadow across her seat. "I told you to get off my bus," he snarled. "And if you won't do it yourself, I'll make you." Clara's expression didn't waver. "You lay one finger on me," she said evenly, "and you'll regret it." But her warning did nothing to deter him. Hansen grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her halfway out of her seat. The bus erupted into chaos, passengers leaping to their feet. "Stop him!" someone shouted. "Let her go!" yelled the young man recording, rushing forward with his phone still pointed at Hansen. Hansen shoved the young man back with his free hand, sending him stumbling into another seat. Clara winced, but refused to cry out. Her resolve remained unbroken, even as Hansen dragged her farther. "This is assault," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. "You're not above the law, no matter what you think." At that moment the bus doors slammed open. The officers stormed back in, their expressions hard as stone. "Stop! Right now!" barked the first officer, his hand instinctively reaching for his belt. "Driver, let her go." Hansen froze for a fraction of a second, his head snapping toward the officers. His anger now mingled with defiance. "She's disrupting my bus. I'm just doing my job." "That's not your job," the officer snapped, stepping closer. "And if you don't let her go this second, you're going to be in cuffs." Hansen hesitated, his grip loosening before he finally released Clara's arm. She straightened herself in her seat, smoothing her sleeve with calm precision. The officer turned to her, concern flashing across his face. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I'm fine," Clara replied, her voice steady, though her eyes remained locked on Hansen. "But he isn't." The second officer stepped forward, the handcuffs on his belt catching the light. "Driver," he said coldly, "you're under arrest for assault. Turn around and put your hands behind your back." "What?" Hansen roared, his voice echoing through the bus. "You can't be serious. I'm the one in charge here." "Not anymore," the officer replied curtly, grabbing Hansen's arm and spinning him around to secure the cuffs. Hansen struggled, but the officer held firm. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law," he said as the bus watched in stunned silence. "This is ridiculous," Hansen yelled as the officer marched him down the aisle. He craned his neck to glare at Clara. "You'll regret this, lady." Clara finally spoke, her voice calm but sharp as a blade. "I think the only one with regrets here will be you." The officer guided Hansen down the steps and into the throng of the growing crowd. Cameras and phones flashed in every direction. A reporter shouted questions, her microphone extended toward Hansen as he was loaded into a waiting police car. His face was a twisted mix of rage and disbelief. Inside the bus, a wave of applause broke out. The teenage girl clapped loudly, a grin spreading across her face. "Finally, some justice," she exclaimed. The young man with the phone turned back to Clara. "Still recording." "Ma'am, that was incredible. Everyone's going to see this." Clara gave him a faint smile, her composure softening for the first time. "Good," she said quietly. "Maybe it'll make people think twice about staying silent." The officer who had arrested Hansen returned to the bus and addressed Clara directly. "Ma'am, we're going to make sure this gets properly documented. Do you want to press charges?" Clara nodded firmly. "Absolutely." The officer tipped his hat slightly. "We'll handle the rest from here. You just sit tight." As he exited the bus again, the cheers from the crowd outside grew even louder. Inside, the passengers exchanged glances, their earlier unease replaced by a shared sense of relief and solidarity. Clara sat quietly, folding her hands in her lap, her calm demeanor a testament to her strength. She gazed out the window at the sea of people, their voices calling for justice. The world outside was watching, and Clara Hayes was now at the center of it all. The chants outside shifted to a new rhythm, now echoing Clara Hayes' name. She had become a symbol of defiance, a quiet yet powerful figure standing resolutely against injustice. The bus doors closed, and a replacement driver, a young woman with a gentle demeanor and kind eyes, stepped aboard. She glanced at Clara and offered a warm smile. "Where to next?" the driver asked, her tone light but respectful. Clara eased back into her seat, her shoulders relaxing for the first time. "Forward," she said simply. The police cruiser carrying Greg Hansen sped away from the scene, its sirens wailing faintly as it disappeared into the distance. Outside, the crowd erupted into cheers and applause, their voices echoing triumphantly. Inside the bus, the mood shifted. Passengers who had been wary and hesitant now buzzed with a mixture of relief and pride. Clara remained seated at the front, her posture poised and dignified. She rubbed her arm where Hansen had grabbed her. The brief pause a reminder of the ordeal, before folding her hands neatly in her lap. The young man with the phone stepped closer, his recording still active. His earlier defiance had softened into genuine concern. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, his voice quieter than before. Clara met his gaze, her tone steady and resolute. "It'll take more than that to shake me," she replied. The teenage girl, still clutching her backpack tightly, stepped forward hesitantly. Her eyes sparkled with admiration as she spoke. "You were amazing," she said. "I can't believe you stood up to him like that." Clara's gaze swept across the bus, taking in the faces of the passengers. "It wasn't just for me," she said, her voice carrying an air of quiet wisdom. "Sometimes you have to take a stand, even when it's uncomfortable." Her words seemed to resonate deeply. The man in the suit, who had been silent for much of the ordeal, finally spoke. "You've got more courage than most people, Mrs. Hayes," he said with a small nod of respect. "What you did today, it inspired all of us. That man got exactly what he deserved." The young mother, still holding her child close, leaned forward. Her voice was tinged with guilt as she admitted, "I'm sorry I didn't speak up sooner. I didn't want to make things worse." Clara offered her a kind smile. "It's never easy," she said gently, "especially when fear takes over. But every voice matters. Remember that next time." The young man holding the phone glanced at his screen and interrupted, his excitement evident. "Your video is already blowing up," he said. "I just checked. Tens of thousands of views already. People are sharing it everywhere." Clara raised an eyebrow, a subtle smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Well," she said, "it seems the truth has a way of getting out." Before anyone could respond, the replacement driver, petite and exuding quiet authority, adjusted her uniform cap and addressed the passengers. Her voice cut through the chatter with calm confidence. "Good morning," she said. "I'll be taking over for the rest of the route. Sorry for the delay, folks." Her eyes found Clara, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Mrs. Hayes?" she asked, her tone filled with respect. Clara inclined her head slightly. "Yes? I just want to say thank you," the driver said. "What you did today, it wasn't just for you, it was for all of us." The bus fell silent, the weight of her words settling over everyone. Clara nodded her gratitude, unspoken but clear in her expression. The driver returned to her seat, and the bus hummed back to life. As it began moving forward again, the passengers started talking among themselves, their earlier apprehension giving way to shared perspectives. Some wondered aloud how Hansen had kept his job for so long, while others expressed outrage at the system that had enabled his behavior. Clara listened quietly, her presence a steady anchor amid the buzz of voices. The young man with the phone eventually sat beside her, lowering his camera for the first time. "What happens next?" he asked, his tone curious. Clara's expression turned thoughtful. "I press charges," she said firmly, "and then we see where the fight takes us." He nodded slowly. "I think a lot of people are going to want to help. Your video, it's bigger than just this bus. It has to be." Clara's gaze didn't waver. "Change doesn't come from silence," she replied. The teenage girl, now sitting across from them, leaned forward. "Do you think they'll fire him for good?" she asked. Clara's lips tightened briefly. "I don't know," she admitted, "but whatever happens to him, I'll make sure people see what he stood for. That's what matters." The bus pulled up to the next stop, and a handful of passengers disembarked. Outside, the crowd had thinned slightly, but a few people remained, waving their signs and cheering as Clara glanced out the window. She raised her hand in acknowledgement, a subtle but powerful gesture that drew another round of applause. As the bus moved forward, Clara felt a quiet resolve settle over her. The road ahead would be challenging, but the voices around her had found strength, and that was a victory in itself. By the next day, news of the bus altercation had spread like wildfire. Clara Hayes's name was on everyone's lips. The young man's video had gone viral, racking up millions of views across social media. Major news outlets picked up the story, airing the footage of Greg Hansen's unprovoked aggression and subsequent arrest. Public outrage was immediate, with protests forming outside the New Ashton Transit Authority headquarters. Hashtags like Justice for Clara and End Transit Bias trended worldwide. Clara, however, remained composed amid the storm. She sat in her modest living room, her phone constantly buzzing with calls, texts, and notifications. Reporters clamored for interviews, and activists reached out offering support. Despite the noise, Clara focused on the next step, holding both Hansen and the Transit Authority accountable. That afternoon, her lawyer, Laura Jenkins, arrived at Clara's home. Laura, a sharp-dressed civil rights attorney in her mid-30s, exuded quiet authority. She had reached out to Clara after seeing the viral video. Now, she spread a stack of documents across the coffee table, her expression a mix of determination and gravity. "This case is bigger than just one man," Laura said, tapping a file labeled Transit Authority Misconduct Complaints. "Hansen has a history, racial profiling, verbal abuse, but the Transit Authority has consistently swept it under the rug. They protected him." Clara nodded slowly, her expression hardening. "Then it's not just him we need to hold accountable. It's the system that let him get away with it." "Exactly," Laura replied, her eyes gleaming with approval. "We're not just going after Hansen for assault. We're going after the New Ashton Transit Authority for negligence and fostering a culture of discrimination." Clara leaned back in her chair, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "Do you think we can win?" Laura's gaze didn't waver. "With the public on our side, yes, but it won't be easy. The Transit Authority is already circling the wagons. They'll try to discredit you and spin this into something else." "They can try," Clara said, her lips tightening. "But the truth is out there. People saw what happened." Laura nodded. "That's why we'll use everything we have, the video, witness statements, Hansen's arrest. It all builds a strong case, but we'll need you to testify." Clara's eyes flickered with resolve. "I'll do whatever it takes." In the days that followed, Clara and Laura worked tirelessly to prepare for the trial. Witnesses from the bus began stepping forward, their statements painting a damning picture of Hansen's behavior. The teenage girl who had spoken up during the incident gave a powerful account of what she had seen, her words brimming with youthful clarity. The young man who had recorded the video provided not just his footage, but also his testimony, emphasizing how Hansen's aggression had escalated without provocation. Even passengers who had remained silent during the confrontation found the courage to come forward. One middle-aged woman, speaking to Laura during a meeting, admitted, "I've seen him treat other people like that before. I always thought it wasn't my place to say anything, but now I see how wrong I was." As the trial date approached, the New Ashton Transit Authority released a carefully worded statement expressing regret over the incident and promising to review policies to ensure fairness and inclusivity. The statement, however, rang hollow to many. Activists and community leaders lambasted it, demanding more tangible actions. Meanwhile, Hansen's lawyer took a different approach, holding a press conference to paint his client as the victim. "Mr. Hansen was simply enforcing the rules to maintain order on his bus," the lawyer claimed. "This situation has been blown out of proportion by a viral video that doesn't tell the whole story." Clara watched the broadcast with Laura, her jaw tightening in disbelief. "Enforcing the rules?" she repeated, her voice edged with incredulity. "Do they really think anyone's going to buy that?" Laura smirked grimly. "They're desperate," she said. The storm continued to grow, but Clara remained steadfast. The fight was far from over, but with each new voice that joined hers, she felt the tide turning. The day of the trial arrived, and the courthouse was alive with activity. Protesters filled the steps outside, holding signs that read, "Justice for Clara" and "Accountability now." Reporters crowded near the entrance, their cameras flashing and microphones at the ready. Clara Hayes arrived alongside her attorney, Laura Jenkins, her head held high. Her presence commanded respect as she walked up the steps, her every movement met with cheers from the crowd. Chanting her name, the supporters outside amplified her resolve. "You've got this," Laura said, placing a reassuring hand on Clara's shoulder. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Greg Hansen sat at the defendant's table, a mix of defiance and discomfort etched across his face. His lawyer leaned in, whispering something into his ear, but Hansen avoided looking up. Clara took her seat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. As the judge entered, the room quieted, and the trial began. Laura rose for her opening statement, her voice clear and unwavering as she addressed the jury. "This case isn't just about an assault on a city bus," she began. "It's about a pattern of abuse and discrimination that has been allowed to continue unchecked for far too long. My client, Mrs. Clara Hayes, stood up not just for herself but for every person who has been silenced by injustice. Today we ask you to hold Mr. Hansen and the New Ashton Transit Authority accountable for their actions." Clara glanced at the jury and noted their rapt attention. This was only the beginning, but she felt confident they had a strong case. The fight was far from over, but the truth was on their side. The first witness, a middle-aged woman who had been seated near the back of the bus during the incident, took the stand. Her hands fidgeted nervously, but her voice remained steady as she answered Laura's questions. "I saw everything," the woman said. "Mrs. Hayes just wanted to sit down. She wasn't bothering anyone. It was the driver who started yelling at her." Laura nodded, her tone encouraging but professional. "And how would you describe his tone?" The witness hesitated, glancing uneasily at the defendant's table where Hansen sat stiffly. It was loud, aggressive, like he wanted to make her feel small. "And did you feel his behavior was justified?" Laura asked. "Not at all," the woman said firmly. "He was out of line. It was embarrassing to watch." Laura offered a faint smile. "Thank you. No further questions." The defense attorney rose next, his expression sharp and calculating. He approached the witness slowly, as though preparing to dismantle her testimony piece by piece. "Ma'am, you mentioned feeling embarrassed," he began. "Isn't it true that your embarrassment could have colored your perception of my client's actions?" The woman frowned, caught off guard. "I don't think so." "You don't think so?" the attorney pressed, his tone bordering on condescension. "But isn't it possible that you interpreted his tone as aggressive because of your own discomfort with the situation?" Laura stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor," leading the witness. "Sustained," the judge said, casting a warning glance at the defense attorney. "Move on." The defense attorney stepped back, feigning disappointment. No further questions. The next witness was the teenage girl who had spoken up for Clara during the altercation. Gone was her youthful bravado, replaced by a nervous but determined energy as she recounted the events. "I saw him grab her," the girl said, her voice trembling slightly. "She didn't do anything to deserve that." Laura approached her with a reassuring smile. "You spoke up during the incident, didn't you?" "Yes," the girl replied. "And what did you say?" "I told him he couldn't treat her like that." "And how did he respond?" "He yelled at me to sit down and stay out of it," she said, her voice growing steadier. "But I couldn't. It wasn't right." Laura nodded warmly. "You showed courage that day. Thank you for speaking out." The defense attorney attempted to rattle her, focusing on her youth and suggesting she might have been too inexperienced to fully understand the situation. But the girl's resolve held firm, her answers concise and unwavering. The most compelling moment came when the young man who had recorded the incident took the stand. Not only did he provide his video evidence, but he also gave a first-hand account of Hansen's escalating aggression. "He grabbed her," the young man said, his voice steady and firm. "No one provoked him. He just lost it." At Laura's cue, the video played for the court, capturing every moment in vivid detail. The sound of Hansen yelling, the gasps of the passengers, and the chants from the crowd outside. The footage filled the courtroom, painting an undeniable picture of what had occurred. By the time the video ended, the jury's expressions were solemn. Laura turned back to the young man. "Why did you record this incident?" "Because I've seen stuff like this happen before," he replied. "People get away with it because no one speaks up. I wanted to make sure this time was different." "And do you feel it was different?" Laura asked. The young man glanced at Clara and smiled faintly. Yeah, Mrs. Hayes made it different. The defense attorney attempted to cast doubt on the video's context, but the jury's reaction made it clear the evidence had left a lasting impact. As Clara sat listening, she felt the tide of the trial turning. The truth, bolstered by the courage of others, was beginning to shine through. The defense attempted to cast doubt on the video, suggesting it might lack context, but the jury's reaction made it clear the footage had left a deep impression. When Clara herself took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She was a picture of composure, her voice calm but layered with quiet strength as she recounted her experience. I paid my fare like everyone else, she said. I just wanted to sit down. But the moment I did, he decided I didn't belong there. Laura's voice softened as she asked, Why didn't you move to the back of the bus when he told you to? Clara paused, her eyes scanning the room before answering. Because it wasn't about the seat, it was about dignity. If I had moved, I would have been saying his actions were acceptable, and they weren't. The jury hung on her every word. Even Greg Hansen, who had spent much of the trial avoiding her gaze, now seemed unable to look away. Laura stepped closer. What do you hope to achieve with this case? Clara's voice grew stronger, each word carrying conviction. Accountability, not just for Mr. Hansen, but for the system that allowed him to act this way for so long. This isn't just about me. It's about making sure no one else has to go through what I did. The room was silent as Laura nodded. No further questions. The defense's cross-examination was sharp, but Clara's composure never wavered. She countered each question with poise, her responses firm and unwavering. By the time she stepped down, it was evident her testimony had made a profound impact. The trial was far from over, but Clara had set the tone. The truth was out, and the fight for justice was gaining momentum. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as the defense prepared to present their case. Greg Hansen, looking more deflated than defiant, was called to the stand. He adjusted his tie nervously and avoided eye contact with Clara as he took his seat. Hansen's lawyer began with carefully crafted questions designed to paint him in a sympathetic light. Mr. Hansen, the lawyer began smoothly, can you explain your perspective on the events of that day? Hansen cleared his throat, his voice shaky but firm. I was just trying to do my job, he said. The front seats are priority seats. I told her to move because that's the rule. I didn't mean to cause trouble. I was just enforcing policy. And when Mrs. Hayes refused to comply, the lawyer pressed. I gave her chances to move, Hansen replied, his tone growing defensive. I tried to keep things under control, but she wouldn't listen. It created a scene, and I had to act. Laura narrowed her eyes, scribbling notes as she listened. Her turn would come soon enough. Do you believe you acted reasonably in the moment? The lawyer continued. Hansen nodded. Yes, I was following protocol. The defense lawyer turned to the jury, gesturing toward Hansen. Mr. Hansen was put in a difficult situation. As a bus driver, his priority is the safety and efficiency of his route. When someone disrupts that, he has to act quickly. Laura stood abruptly. Objection, Your Honor. The defense is testifying. Sustained, the judge replied. Counselor, stick to questioning. The defense lawyer nodded smoothly, refocusing. Would you say your actions were in any way motivated by Mrs. Hayes's race? Hansen's expression hardened. Absolutely not. I treat all my passengers the same. When Laura approached for cross-examination, her steps were deliberate, her demeanor calm yet commanding. She stood silently for a moment, letting the weight of the courtroom settle before speaking. Mr. Hansen, she began, her voice measured, you say you treat all passengers the same. Is that correct? Yes, Hansen replied, his tone clipped. Laura nodded, flipping through a file in her hands. Then can you explain why, over the past 5 years, you've received multiple complaints, 5 of which explicitly reference discriminatory behavior? Hansen stiffened, his jaw tightening. Those complaints were exaggerated. Exaggerated? Laura repeated, her tone neutral. Yes, Hansen snapped, his voice rising defensively. The courtroom grew still as Laura let his words linger. Then, in a voice as sharp as a scalpel, she continued, So, the passengers who accused you of racial profiling, are you saying they lied? I didn't say that, Hansen shot back, his frustration boiling over. Laura raised an eyebrow, her calm demeanor unshaken. No further questions, Your Honor. Hansen's face reddened as he returned to his seat. The cracks in his defense were becoming apparent, and the jury's skeptical expressions suggested they had taken notice. The truth was emerging, piece by piece, and with every revelation, the case against Greg Hansen grew stronger. "I said they exaggerated," Greg Hansen repeated defensively, his tone rising with frustration. Laura Jenkins, maintaining her composure, approached the jury with a stack of documents in hand. "Let me remind the court," she began, her voice steady, "that these are official complaints filed with the New Ashton Transit Authority. Each one details incidents similar to what happened to Mrs. Hayes. Would you like me to read them aloud?" Hansen's lawyer immediately interjected. "Objection. Relevance, Your Honor." "This speaks directly to Mr. Hansen's pattern of behavior and his credibility as a witness," Laura countered without missing a beat. The judge considered for a moment before nodding. "Read. Proceed." Laura turned back to Hansen, her tone sharp but measured. "Let's focus on one particular complaint from last year. A passenger reported that you asked them to move to the back of the bus despite there being plenty of empty seats. Do you recall this incident?" "No," Hansen replied flatly. Laura raised an eyebrow. "You don't recall it? Or you don't want to recall it?" "Objection," the defense lawyer called out. "Sustained," the judge said, but the damage was done. The jury shifted in their seats, their expressions increasingly skeptical. Laura took a step closer, her voice sharpening. "Mr. Hansen, isn't it true that the only protocol you were enforcing that day was your own prejudice?" "That's not true," Hansen snapped, his voice rising. Laura held his gaze, her calm demeanor an unyielding contrast to his growing anger. "The video shows you grabbing Mrs. Hayes. She was seated quietly, posing no threat. Explain to the court how that aligns with your so-called protocol." Hansen faltered, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. She refused to listen. I lost my temper." Laura pounced on his admission. "So you lost your temper. It wasn't about protocol, was it? It was about your inability to handle a passenger who dared to stand up to you." "Objection," Hansen's lawyer leapt to his feet. "Argumentative. Sustained," the judge said, giving Laura a warning look. Laura stepped back slightly, her expression calm. "No further questions, Your Honor." Hansen returned to his seat, his face pale, his earlier bravado completely shattered. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as the jury exchanged meaningful glances. The defense attempted to redirect the focus by calling a representative from the New Ashton Transit Authority to testify. The official delivered a carefully rehearsed statement, emphasizing the organization's commitment to fairness and equality. But Laura was ready. "Is it true," she asked during cross-examination, "that Mr. Hansen was required to undergo sensitivity training after his third misconduct complaint?" The official hesitated before responding. "Yes, that's correct. And yet he continued to receive complaints, didn't he?" The official's shoulders slumped. "Yes." Laura's voice grew sharper. "So, what measures, if any, did the Transit Authority take to address these ongoing issues?" We followed policy," the official stammered. "We investigated each complaint." Laura turned to the jury, her tone cutting. "And yet, Mr. Hansen was allowed to continue driving unchecked until his actions were caught on camera. Is that what you call accountability?" The official didn't respond, their silence damning. By the end of the day, Laura's cross-examinations had exposed not only Hansen's behavior but also the systemic failures that had enabled him. The tide of the trial was shifting, and Clara could feel it. As she walked out of the courtroom with Laura by her side, the crowd outside erupted into cheers. Their voices rose in celebration, a powerful reminder that the truth was emerging piece by piece and that justice felt closer than ever. The courtroom was silent as both sides prepared for their closing arguments. The tension was palpable, every eye focused on the attorneys standing at their respective tables. Clara Hayes sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, her composure unshaken, though her hands rested tightly together in her lap. Laura rose first, her movements deliberate as she approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice firm but measured, "you've heard the testimony, you've seen the video. This case is not complicated. Greg Hansen assaulted Mrs. Clara Hayes, not because she broke any rules, but because she refused to bend to his prejudice." She gestured toward Clara. Mrs. Hayes paid her fare, she followed every posted guideline. Yet she was singled out, berated, humiliated, and physically removed from her seat. Why? Because Mr. Hansen saw someone he thought he could overpower, someone whose dignity he thought didn't matter. Laura stepped closer to the jury, her gaze sweeping across their faces. This isn't just about one bus ride. It's about a system that has allowed this behavior to go unchecked for years. The New Ashton Transit Authority knew about Mr. Hansen's history. They knew he had complaints, and they did nothing. By ignoring the problem, they enabled it. The room was silent as Laura's words hung in the air. The jury's faces reflected a mixture of anger and understanding. Laura turned slightly, gesturing toward Clara again. Mrs. Hayes stood up, not just for herself, but for everyone who has ever been silenced by injustice. Today, we ask you to hold Mr. Hansen and the New Ashton Transit Authority accountable for their actions. She returned to her seat, her expression resolute. The truth was out, and the fight for justice was nearing its conclusion. The courtroom remained silent as Laura returned to her seat. The defense attorney rose, his expression carefully composed. "Members of the jury," he began, "my client, Greg Hansen, did not act out of malice. He was enforcing policies designed to maintain order and safety on public transit. Mrs. Hayes's refusal to comply escalated the situation." He hesitated, his tone growing more pleading than persuasive. "My client regrets his actions, but they were not rooted in prejudice. He is not a villain. He is a man who made a mistake in a high-pressure situation." With that, the defense attorney returned to his seat, his argument noticeably lacking the conviction and passion of Laura's. The jury deliberated for several hours. Their furrowed brows and hushed conversations reflected the gravity of the case. Clara waited patiently at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Beside her, Laura maintained her calm demeanor, though the intensity of her focus was evident. When the jury finally returned, the room collectively held its breath. The foreperson rose, holding a small slip of paper. "In the matter of Hayes versus Hansen and the New Ashton Transit Authority," she began, "we find the defendant, Greg Hansen, guilty of assault and misconduct." A wave of emotion swept through the room. Clara closed her eyes briefly, relief and quiet triumph washing over her. The foreperson continued, "We also find the New Ashton Transit Authority liable for negligence in failing to address repeated complaints against Mr. Hansen." A murmur rippled through the courtroom as the weight of the verdict sank in. The judge thanked the jury and announced that sentencing would follow in the coming weeks. For now, justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted into cheers as news of the verdict spread. Protesters waved their signs, many reading "Justice for Clara" and "Accountability Now." Their voices echoed across the courthouse steps, carrying the victory into the air. Clara stepped out into the sunlight, flanked by Laura and a small group of supporters. Reporters surged forward, microphones and cameras jostling for space. "Mrs. Hayes, how do you feel about the verdict?" one reporter called out. Clara paused, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I feel grateful," she said, "not just for myself, but for everyone who stood with me. This isn't just my victory, it's ours, and it's proof that standing up for what's right can make a difference." Laura stepped in, adding with confidence, "This case sends a clear message. No one is above accountability, and no one should have to endure discrimination. Today, justice prevailed, but the work doesn't end here." The crowd's cheers grew louder as Clara raised her hand in a subtle wave. She knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about the movement she had sparked. In the weeks that followed, the New Ashton Transit Authority announced sweeping reforms. These included mandatory anti-bias training for all employees and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to address misconduct. Greg Hansen was sentenced to community service and ordered to attend anger management classes. His career as a bus driver was effectively over. Clara returned to her quiet life, though she often found herself at the center of community events and discussions about systemic change. She spoke at schools, community centers, and forums, her story becoming a powerful symbol of resilience and the importance of standing up for justice. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, her phone buzzed. A message from Laura lit up the screen. "We did it. Thank you for trusting me." Clara smiled softly, her heart full. The fight had been long and difficult, but every moment had been worth it. She had stood her ground, and in doing so had helped make the world a better place.